Well, here we are. Bit of a fire. If I told you that I wanted to sell you the last ticket on the last train to hell, you'd laugh. You'd laugh. I'd laugh too. But when you look at the type of society we've created and the problems that we face, and how COVID-19 has exposed fault lines to the rest of society, which we have been talking about for decades, I think it's realistic for us to challenge the current models that this society is based on, and most societies around the world. Because we live in a capitalist society. A capitalist society is a society which is based on the creation of ever-increasing profits, irrespective of the human, social, environmental and national costs. You know that and I know that. Capitalism is private investment for private profit. And COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic has done what we haven't been able to do. Is that it has exposed the fallacy of the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation pathway that we've tread around the world since the Thatcher-Reagan era. Now, it was interesting to hear the Treasurer, the Federal Treasurer, Mr. Josh Frydenberg, talk about Reagan and Thatcher as his heroes. And I'd just like to remind our Treasurer, although I'm just somebody doing a YouTube presentation, he's Treasurer of the country, just like to remind him that Thatcherism and Reaganism was about three things. It was about reducing taxes for the wealthy. Huge reductions in taxes for the wealthy. And we've seen the consequences of that policy, where the gap between the rich and poor has increased. And the life of the middle class has become a little bit more not as solid as it used to be. The second thing that Thatcherism and Reaganism was all about was austerity. That's a fancy word for saying squeezing the last drop of people, the last drop of blood from people. Increased taxation, deregulation, and the list goes on and on. And the third thing Thatcherism and Reaganism was all about is about destroying workplace conditions that have been won over generations and destroying organisation that represent working people. And we've seen the consequences of that. And the consequences are very simple. The consequences are casualised workforce, part-time workforce, mobile workforce controlled by labour hire companies. And to ensure that this occurred in Australia, we've had a huge temporary migration program, which they've had around many other places in the world, where about 1 in 6 Australian workers are here on temporary work visas. So it's an interesting situation we find ourselves in. The aged care sector, what's happened to the aged care sector is nothing new. But COVID-19 has highlighted what happens when you have a mobile, casual, flexible, I like that word, flexible workforce. In other words, a workforce that has no legal protections, no holiday pay, no sick pay, no leave loading, no permanency. And when you staff our aged care sector with people in this situation, you don't have to be an Einstein to realise that if there is a COVID-19 epidemic, that it's going to hit the nursing homes, because people there need to work. And they may have minor symptoms, they shrug their shoulders, go to work and spread the infection as we're seeing currently. Especially when you don't have enough time to do the work. You don't actually have the protection equipment. And the paradox, and this is what I find quite fascinating, the paradox of the ageing population in this country, there's over 65% of Australians over the age of 60 voted for the Liberal National Party at the last election. And they voted for them to a significant degree because of fear. Fear of what was going to happen. It was quite an extensive, fear-driven campaign in the corporate-owned media, and to a lesser extent in the government-gelded ABC, which made people very, very frightened, especially elderly people. And although the question of franking credits had really no impact on the majority of elderly people, people fell for the propaganda and voted for the Liberal National Party. Well, at the same time, the Liberal National Party has been disrespectful of elderly people now for decades. Through their policies, and their aged care policies and their Medicare policies, their attempts to privatise large swathes of Medicare, through their social security policies, we've seen the total disdain that they've had for working people in this country. So the model goes further. If you look at education, we have an education sector which is funded by overseas students. Now that market has collapsed. The government doesn't know how to fund that sector. We have a healthcare sector, public healthcare sector, which has been increasingly privatised. We have a public education sector where funds are being given hand over foot to the private sector at the expense of the public education sector. We have a shrinking manufacturing sector where we rely on overseas imports. And at the same time, we have a sector which could finance a good public health system, public education system, a universal basic income, social security system, and that's the mining sector. We are only 25 million people living on a continent, resource-rich continent. We have over 700,000 children living in poverty in this country. We have 1/3 of the population living on social security benefits. We have a shrinking number of multi-millionaires and billionaires, most of whom have made their fortunes through the mining sector. It's quite extraordinary to see the amount of money which is made from the mining sector. We have many mineral resources in this country that are being exploited by the private sector. Iron ore, uranium, bauxite, coal, rare earth, diamonds, minerals, lithium, and the list goes on and on and on. And all these sectors have been exploited by the private sector, and what we get in return is a few royalties, and if we're lucky, we get a little bit of taxation revenue. Unlike the Norwegians, who have a wealth fund where their oil reserves are pumped into that wealth fund, and we've got a population of 4.5 million in Norway with $1 trillion in their wealth fund to act as a bulwark against any disasters. So here we are in 2020. Our resources have been exploited. We're getting very little return for these resources, and if we control these resources, we would be in a position, a very good position, to be able to manage things in this country in a very effective way. We could be the envy of the world as far as manufacturing is concerned, as far as social security is concerned, as far as universal basic income is concerned. So why do we find ourselves in 2020 where they're trying to sell us the last ticket on the last train to hell when we don't need to go in that direction? There is no need for further privatisation. There is no need to keep natural resources in private hands. There is no need for people on social security benefits to live marginal existence. There's no need for homelessness. There's no need for childhood poverty. And the reason we are in this situation is because we have allowed it to become this way, because we have been more interested in getting a few consumer goods at reduced prices as imports than actually creating a society which looks after everybody in this country. So it is an important situation. And then we've got the looming climate emergency, which nobody's talking about during the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, the climate emergency hasn't gone away. We have increased CO2 emissions. They will continue. we need to make major structural changes to the country, but because the mining sector is in private hands and people's employment is dependent on certain sections of the mining sector, we see no move to address the issue of climate change, climate emergency, as we saw during the last federal election, when Queensland voters fell hook, line and sinker for the idea that we need to continue in this direction in order to, keep a few jobs. Let's not forget that the mining sector only employs about 2.7% of the population. So we have all these issues that we face. And as we face this issue, all the Treasurer and the Prime Minister can do is talk about Thatcherism and Reaganism in various forms. Things like reduced taxes for the rich, investment, 20% investment savings for people in the private sector using money to invest. Then we've got franking credits, this ticking time bomb of billions of dollars being given away for people who own shares. We've got things like in the real estate section where you can actually get a tax refund or a tax discount for owning more than one home. And the list goes on and on and on. And we find that ourselves in this situation where we've been sold these tickets on the train to hell, but everybody's telling us, well, it's all right. It's not a train to hell, it's a train to prosperity. We've been told this is the way it needs to be done. Only the private sector can actually solve our problems. You can see that the flames have gone up again. And this is the situation we find ourselves in, battling bushfires over and over and over again because of the type of social system, because of the models we are using for society to function. And now's the time for major change. It's very interesting that Facebook, which is a privately owned and run organisation, made a decision about over 6 months ago to list public interest before corporate interest, who I'm doing the YouTube presentation for, has an organisation which does not meet community standards. While we have, pedophiles and misogynists and racists and terrorists and state-funded terrorists, having their say on Facebook over and over again, an organisation which is acting legally, which is attempting to register as a federal political party, which has policies like a universal basic income to resolve the insecurity we currently face, which has policies regarding public education and public health and public housing, and policies regarding negotiating a treaty with this country's First Nations people, is considered by Facebook to be an organisation that does not meet community standards. Now, I take this as an honour. It is an honour to be told that what they represent is the community standard. But I don't believe that is the community standard. I think what the COVID-19 pandemic is doing is highlighting the fault lines in society, fault lines that we have been talking about and arguing about and agitating about and campaigning about for decades. It is beginning to highlight those fault lines, and as September comes and December comes, and as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to expose those fault lines, we will find more and more Australians who find themselves in difficult situations who may change their opinions about franking credits, about negative gearing, about private ownership of this country's resources, about the destruction of the public education and public health sector, who may change their opinions about public housing, who may realise that people cannot live on $40 a day in the 2020 as far as social security benefits are concerned, who will understand that Reaganism and Thatcherism, decreased taxes for the rich, austerity for the poor, and the destruction of any organisation which resists that implementation of those policies is not the way forward for this country. Fires come and go, but this fire is being fanned on many fronts. It has been fanned by the climate emergency. It has been fanned by incompetence. It has been fanned by the domination of every aspect of our existence by private organisations. It has been fanned by the fact that fewer and fewer people own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. It's been fanned by a social media which is more interested in the erudite, the unimportant, the mundane, than asking the important questions and acting. So once again, I ask you to consider joining public interest before corporate interests. If you're not a person who joins organisations, think again. If we want change, we can do nothing individually. We can raise ideas and that's it. If we want change, if we want reform, if we want much needed radical change, we need to become involved. So I'm encouraging you to join public interest before corporate interest. Currently we have 431 members on the electoral roll. We need 550 before we can register as apply for registration as a federal political party. We're on the way there. So come and join us, the fastest growing political movement in this country. Public interest before corporate interest. Put the interests of the many before the interests of the few. If you don't want your children and our grandchildren and their children and future generations and current generations to be burned by the fire that's engulfing us as individuals and as a community, it's time to take practical action. You can join us very simply. If you're on the net, you can download an application form from pibci.net, pibci.net. If you don't have a printer, you can always leave a message on 0439 395 489. That's 0439 395 489. If you don't have, not on the internet, I don't know how you're watching this YouTube presentation, but if you're not, you can always write to us at Post Office Box 20 Parkville 3052. Remember, your future is in your hands. It is not in the hands of religious leaders. It is not in the hands of secular leaders. It is not in the hands of the state. And let's not forget that ultimate political authority in a democratic society doesn't rest in the hands of the state, the government of the day, the corporate sector, or the bureaucracy. Ultimate political authority in a democratic society rests in the hands of the people. Join public interest before corporate interests. Give Facebook the punishment they deserve. Keep safe during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially if you live in the Mitchell Shire or the Melbourne metropolitan region. Wear a mask, maintain social distance. Before we know it, we'll need you out on the streets once this pandemic is under control, because there will need to be major structural reforms, there will need to be major changes, there will need to be major political changes as far as our thinking is concerned. And the first thing that we should start agitating for right now is the nationalisation of all our mineral resources. Not only can we compensate First Nations people and ensure that they have a profitable and prosperous future, but we can also look after the needs of everybody else. Why should a handful of people, a handful of corporations profit from what is our Commonwealth? We do live in the Commonwealth of Australia.